switching directions a little bit, you do the drive-through every single week where you're asked questions.
Every week.
So, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about things that you've went over at length, but I want to bounce all over the map when it comes to this interrogation. So one of the things that you're famous for currently is being wrestling's biggest critic, and that criticism rains down in buckets all over All Elite Wrestling. So I want to touch on something of an armchair booker question, if you would entertain such a thing.
Sure.
So, and of course this is hypothetical world because there's no way you would even take this job. But as the head guy in charge of AEW, you find yourself in charge of AEW. What 3 guys would you fire and what 3 guys would you push?
Oh, good Lord. Well, obviously the push is easy. CM Punk just got there and he's lit up their ratings whenever he's been in a meaningful position, and he's liable, if they'll let him, to bring back some lapsed fans. Bryan Danielson, obviously he became Merlin the Magician this past week and got a serious and intelligent match out of Kenny Olivier. There's a few others, to be honest. There's guys, I love MJF. I love the potential of Powerhouse Hobbs. I think Ricky Starks is a talent. You know, FTR are the best in-ring tag team in the profession.
Agreed.
Who would I fire easily? Get rid of Twinkle Toes, old Kenny Olivier, and his friends, the Hardley Boys, the Cucamonga Kids. Because I have criticized AEW, and also lately I've praised them because they've started now with the influx of more serious top-level talent who know how to put their shit together and aren't just playing wrestler and doing this so they can do cool moves and dress up in costumes and imitate video game characters. When you get serious top talent like that can appeal to a wider group of people, by nature, the show gets better. And just this past Wednesday night from the tennis stadium, Arthur Ashe, they did the best, most professional, serious, logical, top-to-bottom television program that they've done yet. The problem is that they started off, Tony Khan was convinced that he could be a booker for a national television show with absolutely no experience besides doing it for fun when he was in high school. And you take wrestling booking out of the equation and apply that sentence to anything else. Heart surgery, auto repair, what the fuck, right? Being a lawyer. That's gall.
It was almost like he was playing with action figures. That's kind of how it kind of seems to me. It's like he's playing with action figures, but they're real life people.
And the second problem was that he was convinced, because of this mass hysteria, that I like to call them the very loud minority, the people who were into this elite business and the New Japan Bullet. They sold a lot of Bullet Club shirts from New Japan because it just said Bullet Club, and people thought it had something to do with guns. It's in the store. They're like, Bullet Club. Yeah, whatever the fuck.
Right.
But anyway, to get involved with those 3, I knew that they couldn't be serious from the start. I knew that they were going to do things to embarrass the wrestling business and make mockery of it being fake, because their business is fake. My wrestling business wasn't fake. It was predetermined. It was a work, but it wasn't fake. Their business is fake because they're fake people, because they pretend to be wrestlers, and they wink at the audience, and they won't let anybody believe anything, and they think that childishness is what's going to engender them to their fan base, which it does, and it runs everybody else off. So that was the problem I had with the company from the beginning, and I've criticized when they put on stuff that either doesn't make sense, isn't ready for prime time, or doesn't maximize the strengths of the talent that they have, because I wanted somebody to compete with the WWE. Good Lord, that is what they're doing now is not even a good game show for Nickelodeon. Raw, SmackDown, whatever they're doing with NXT now.
NXT like 2.0.
Kids finger painting.
Right.
OVW television was on one station in Louisville, and a satellite station in London, Kentucky was more professionally put together with more experienced talent than last week's NXT was. So it's not that I'm a WWE fan. I wanted somebody to come along and be serious and put together a wrestling program people could be proud of, instead of something that again made mockery and made fun of wrestling. People have been making fun of wrestling wrestling that didn't like it for 100 years. But never before in the history of our business have the people in the business been making fun of their own business on their own television show. And that's what I will not forgive. And whether it's the guy that wrestles sex dolls or the guys that super kick kids in the ring for their birthday or whatever, AEW started out, their first show had a legless man in a battle royal.
True.
And yeah, I'm not making this up.
Nope, you aren't.
And I'm like, what the, I cannot in good conscience just say, oh, well, it's different. It's not Vince, so therefore it's got to be great like some of these people are. I can't do that.
Well, a question.
So when they do something, and go ahead, hold on, Stevie, you can redirect in a second. When they do something praiseworthy, I praise them. And they've been doing more of that lately because they've gotten more professional talent in, but still the root of their little company there is the ones that want to just make a mockery of everything. And I used to fucking fight people over that. I'm not going to goddamn pat him on the back for it now. Go ahead, Stephen. I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Your Honor. Stephen P. New on behalf of the plaintiff. You've heard that a time or two. Let's take wrestling. Let's take wrestling in phases, if we can, and kind of a follow-up to Reznor's question. I view wrestling history in phases, and you've already touched on that a little bit this evening. You've got, in my mind, you correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the expert witness here, Mr. Cornette. You've got pre-television, everything 1949 and earlier. You've got television, 50s, 60s, 70s, and kind of that phase. Then you've got the cable and satellite era, 1980, about 15, 16 years up through the mid-90s. Then you've got the Monday Night Wars and the Ruthless Aggression, and you've kind of got this post-Ruthless Aggression PG era where you've had the WWE and some minor companies competing on a national level. Now, there was an evolution of wrestling, over those periods of time. Television wrestling in the 50s, 60s, 70s wasn't the same as a pre-television era. The cable and satellite era, your heyday in the 80s wasn't the same as what you were seeing on television in the 60s. And I'm sure that you, the Midnight Express, and your contemporaries in the 80s may have been criticized by some of those guys from prior eras. It was an evolution of the sport of professional wrestling. How do you view that kind of in those 20-year chunks, if you will? How do you view the evolution of wrestling? And I know that you'd say a lot that it's gotten to this point where, has it evolved into something that doesn't even resemble what it once was? And can it come back? Can it be considered a legitimate combat sport on equal footing with boxing and MMA, in your opinion?
Well, that horse has left the barn, I think. Although on an equal footing with boxing, besides the occasional major boxing match, wrestling has kicked the shit out of boxing for the past 50 years. Let's face it. But MMA came along with the best of both worlds. Boxing has always been a little dry, except at the very top. Ali Frazier will stop the world, but some other heavyweight fights don't even stop traffic. MMA and particularly the UFC came along and used the old wrestling promotional tactics of hyping a fight and concentrating on personalities and drawing real life issues between the fighters into it, or in some cases when the guys were good enough and they could get by with it without Dana White yanking a knot in their tail because he didn't want anything to look too worky, the guys would, talk up their own shit, Chael Sonnen, etc. But the thing is, what you mentioned, the different eras in wrestling and the evolution, by nature, things sped up because you couldn't, when you go back to the 19-teens, there was still betting on wrestling. And part of the reason why you read in those historical accounts a match went 5 hours is because before there were big sports stadiums and there were transportation and people could gather in big crowds and pay big money at the gate, the biggest money sometimes in wrestling in the world title matches and shit was made on betting. And it was like, I bet you they're not going to go another 30 minutes. So I bet you they are. And some, that's the way they would work people. It all evolved to become faster paced for television and then for competition on television television and more colorful. Buddy Rogers would have looked like he'd stepped out of a spaceship in 1920, but in 1955 is, oh my God, he's the atomic blonde, he's cool. Where we went wrong was that all those changes, and you mentioned the Midnight Express, Ole Anderson used to say, you guys are doing too much. Well, that was his opinion, and he made a lot of money, but we knew what got over for us. But what we never did was do so much that it was implausible that a human being could survive it. We didn't do so much that we were just popping up and not selling anything. There was still, we didn't deviate from the concept of wrestling, that it is simulated conflict and that it needs to in some way resemble a struggle or a contest. So I always like to say that I thought that Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat, the trilogy in 1989, was as far sports entertainment as pro wrestling could get and still be considered. They went as far as they could without showing any obvious cooperation, without being entertainment, still being a struggle. But it was so entertaining. And they skirted that line. If you went any further than what they did, it would have to be obvious cooperation, which Shawn Michaels did in the 90s. And there was a little more element of prettiness and performance and athleticism, to be sure, but less of a gritty struggle to Shawn Michaels in the 90s than there was Ric Flair in the 80s. But even Michaels, still kept the concept of a contest and a struggle. And that was first and foremost. If you couldn't do something that didn't show the cooperation and that didn't take the people out of the moment that it was a conflict, then don't do that thing. Now, besides the fact that we have thrown back the doors, opened all the secrets, not only the internet, the promoters themselves, everybody can get involved in the business. Everybody can get a writing job. If they've got a credit, they can spend 6 weeks with the WWE, and then now they all know what's going on, supposedly. There is no mystery left. So whether the people, I try to explain this, and I can't very well, because you've got to understand the concept to begin with, and you have to have seen wrestling the way it used to be presented to know the difference. But it's not that everybody always believed that everything about pro wrestling was real. It's that they knew something was going on, but they didn't know what, and they weren't slapped in the face with it, so they could subliminate that thought and enjoy what they were seeing in front of them, and sometimes get lost in it if the talent was good enough. That was the selling point of wrestling. You have a certain amount of people back in those days that believed everything they saw. Grandmothers and, the whole 9 yards, they believed everything. I've had many of them go to jail to get a hold of me because they believed what they were seeing. But you had a lot more, and especially when you had the sellouts and the big crowds, more people who knew that there was something going on, maybe knew the whole thing was bullshit, but they saw somebody or something. Whether it was Jerry Lawler and Bill Dundee, whether it was Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair, whether it was Bruno Sammartino and Larry Zbyszko, something tripped their trigger, and that led to the record houses because they had to see what was going to happen. What we've done now is let everybody know everything, till where even the wrestlers that come in the business are taught, well, you shouldn't try to be yourself. Tell everybody you're an entertainer, you're playing a character, this is just a part you play. And that's the best wrestlers and the biggest box office attractions weren't playing characters. They were themselves. That was them. They were able to touch people. And unfortunately, that's what we've lost. So now, in summation, Your Honor, the fans in the arena or watching television have never, in the past 130-something years of pro wrestling, known more that the guy coming down the aisle has been told what to say, what to do, how to dress, how long this match is going to go, who's going to win, what his name is. They know that now. That's the entire antithesis of what used to draw money in wrestling, which is when you can find an attraction where say what you want about the business, but that guy, I don't trust him. He's either off or he's crazy or he don't give a shit or he'll go into business for himself or he's not going to do what the promoter tells him, or if I get in his face, he's liable to kick me in the balls. Those guys drew money, and it was more believable and more possible to foster those type of personalities when everybody in the building didn't have everybody's goddamn social security number, tax records, know everybody's business, and that there's a booker and how these things are put together and blah, blah, blah. And now you've almost shit the bed on people believing in it. They believe Brock Lesnar because he does have fuck you money. And he is a fucking mental case in some respect that if he went off, he would go into business for himself. And what are you going to do about it? And he's maybe the only one. And a guy like Walter could be that, but, you know, they haven't pushed him in that direction, and he doesn't have a UFC heavyweight title on his resume. So, you know, but that's what you need, and we don't have that.
You mentioned comic books earlier, and you know my love of territory wrestling. Became a wrestling fan in 1981, watching Angelo Poffo's ICW, Georgia Championship Wrestling on TBS, Mid-Atlantic Wrestling on a station out of Bluefield. Around the time in the mid-'80s, when Vince McMahon Jr. wanted to become the Walt Disney of the professional wrestling world, it seemed to me that a lot of the territory guys wanted their own thing. And I'm going to give you some examples. 1983 in Southwest Championship Wrestling, Joe Blanchard has his own heavyweight champion in Adrian Adonis, who wins Luthez's belt, if you remember that.
Yes.
Not long after that, World Championship Wrestling breaks out of the NWA, has its own world champion. You know, pretty soon after that, the NWA becomes centered on what used to be the Georgia territory and North Carolina. It seems to me, and then, so to my comic book reference, what if somebody had kept the NWA together, and instead of keep letting, you know, Southwest going into business for itself, World Championship Wrestling, and doing that kind of thing, or even, you know, after that, kind of bringing everybody back together, recognizing Vince as the common enemy here. He's poached all your guys. Bill Watts, do I need to convince you that this guy is our enemy here? He poached all your guys, and they're now on the USA Network. What if you keep Southwest, world class, Mid-South, working with Georgia and North Carolina and Florida and, you know, Minnesota and Chicago, if you have to take on Vince as the common enemy?
Well, they tried that with Pro Wrestling USA, and the problems were basically the problems that have always been. The promoters in the NWA could coexist and could work together when they each had their own territory, and they did the meeting once every September, and Sam Muchnick kept everybody from arguing too badly with each other, and they traded talent. But they weren't running each other's territories, and they weren't doing combined shows. Then all of a sudden, when Vince starts this, that's when Pro Wrestling USA, which was Crockett and Vern Gagne and Oldie's Georgia office, because of the TBS time slot that they still had there for a little while. All those promoters were great when they could work together from afar. But when they had to put all their talent on the same card, well, then there's the fight. Well, who's on top? Well, whose guys are viewed as most important? Then you start
going over.
Who's going over? Then you start going down the pecking order. You mentioned Southwest Wrestling. To be honest with you, by 1983, Southwest wouldn't have made a good developmental territory. Their business was on its ass. The reason why they had their own world champion is just because they broke off from the rest of the state of Texas even, because we're trying to do their own thing. But the Pro Wrestling USA in Baltimore and cards they ran in the Northeast, the Meadowlands, they would do big business the first time or two. But part of it, honestly, that a lot of people have not talked about was even when you've got all the megastars from 3 or 4 different promotions, you still have to have people interested in those particular matches that you're making. And the TVs from those individual territories were only pushing their own angles. So if you didn't have AWA World Tag Title between 2 AWA teams, there wasn't any television promotion for it. There wasn't any angles behind it. So they had to have kind of, if they tried to mix the promoters' matches, then they got dream matches, which back then didn't sell like they do today, because you could go to live wrestling 2 to 4 times a month at every town in the country. So they'd seen a lot of those dream matches. They wanted shit with heat behind it. And also the promoters couldn't work together. And you saw in '89 when Vern and Lawler and Jarrett and who Continental was involved, did the Super Clash thing in pay-per-view in Chicago. Well, that's how Lawler ended up with Vern's belt, because Vern was apparently supposed to pay everybody, but he didn't pay everybody, but he said he wasn't supposed to pay everybody, but I don't know who got paid, but it was that type of shit, right? Ring around the rosy. Vince had a one single crew. Vince had one single vision. Vince had not one television show, but multiple television shows, but geared toward pushing the same content. The others had their own TVs and their own territories, plus we're trying to get together and do those conglomeration tapings, which was a mess. And who's, the tag team champions in Memphis are going to get the shit kicked out of them by the tag team champions that Crockett had. And, it didn't work because it was too fragmented. The NWA championship worked when all those different promoters of all those different areas agreed to recognize one champion, and he traveled amongst those territories. That worked great. Having them all together, trying to all decide, they couldn't figure out what to get for lunch.
Well, you guys pulled completely out of the station and left me at the terminal at AEW, because I have to ask a question about the original question that I had for you about the firing 3 people. And I thought for sure that you were going to pick Joey Janela, Sonny Kiss, and Marco Stunt, because
Jesus Christ, well, I didn't know the first 2 even still worked there, or I would have fired them. Yeah, but I thought they disappeared. I thought somehow sanity had prevailed.
You might be right.
I'm just thinking they keep Dwarf Dongsucker at ringside there because he's got pictures of somebody with a goat. I don't know, but
something.
I don't know if I can fire him, because do they really pay him, or do they just let him show up and suffer his presence?
That might be the reason why he hasn't got the cut. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that there's one person that me and you agree hardcore on that needs to leave. And I don't know why it just made news this week. There's articles all over the place about this, but you've been talking shit about this guy for 2 fucking years. But
you got to narrow it down a little bit more.
Excalibur, Mr. Go into business for himself. I wrestled that guy back in Dusseldorf, Germany. Oh, man, it's so exhausting listening to him do commentary.
Here's another. I don't hate this guy personally or stay awake at night trying to figure out ways to assassinate him. I've never met him in person, right? I am just disgusted at his selfishness. If not his selfishness, then the ignorance of the people around him. Because, again, they have a chance to go on national cable television with a big budget production. And they have announcers like Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone that have a name and goodwill with the people. But to have this supposed expert who's going to tell him what all the new names of the new moves are. If he'd have debuted under his real name, Dash Riprock, I don't know what his name is, or any other name that he wanted to make up as an announcer, that would have been fine, and that would have showed respect for their business, for the business, and for the product. But instead, because he's a mark for himself, and because apparently the people around him, the way he got the job, it's all friends wrestling. If you're school friends with the Young Bucks, or friends from Japan with Kenny Omega, you get jobs. That's been proven. That's what I'll cut. Brandon Cutler, Michael knock it off and get off my television. What all those people? They're just friends of the executive vice presidents. So he gets on the debut episode of a new wrestling promotion wearing a mask and calling himself Excalibur because 15 years ago he used to have independent matches in front of 400 people in a barn in California.
Yeah.
That to me is either arrogance, egotism, stupidity, lack of respect, or nobody around him had the guts to say, no, you might be an announcer, but you're going to be a straight announcer with no mask on, because if you go to your announcer, Bill Watts taught me this, so did Jerry Jarrett. Actually, almost every promoter that ever knew anything that what was going on would say this. Your announcer is your salesman. If you go to the mall and you go to the appliance store and you want to buy a refrigerator, and you know more about the refrigerator than the salesman, or the salesman is wearing a mask and a ballet outfit, and it is just some Halloween function, I'm gonna go find somebody who can tell me about this refrigerator, and I don't think is a complete idiot. You want your salesman to be straight. He needs to have the knowledge, and he doesn't need to look like a complete buffoon. Ronald McDonald doesn't actually sell the burgers himself. He represents the burgers, but I don't think anybody would want to buy them at the counter from Ronald or want him to be cooking. talking.
Yeah.
So that's the point. The guy showed no respect, and it was unprofessional to put him on the air. If it was Rey Mysterio, great. Because if you're watching a wrestling program, you know Rey Mysterio and you know he wears a mask. But this guy, just because he was a mark for himself and he used to play with his friends, now on national television 15 years later, he's going to wear a mask. Fuck him. Feed him fish heads.
Wow, you know what? I just realized in your answer to that the superior intellect of Jim Cornette shines through, because you said you would fire Kenny Omega and the Young Bucks because you know if you cut the head of the snake off, then the rest of the snake dies, and that means that all the friends would leave All Elite Wrestling as well.
The whole rest of the Partridge Family bus would be pulling right out of the parking lot.
Fucking genius.